This is lesson 18 on controlled substance prescriptions. We're going to be covering book pages 90 through 94 in your book. So in this lesson, we're going to be covering electronic prescriptions and also written prescriptions and fax prescriptions, and we're going to be talking in kind of in generalities for all controlled substances. And then in the next lesson, we're going to talk specifically about Schedule II prescriptions because they have a lot of special rules. It's important to know that Florida has mandatory electronic prescriptions. Florida actually has mandatory electronic prescriptions for all prescriptions, not just controlled substances, but it includes controlled substances. However, there are so many exceptions to when electronic prescriptions are not required that you still need to know the details of how to handle written prescriptions, verbal prescriptions when they're authorized, and maybe even fax prescriptions, believe it or not. So just because it's mandatory, there's so many exceptions, you need to study the other forms of prescriptions as well. If you look at the exceptions to when electronic prescriptions are not required on page 91, they're listed for you there on A through H, and there's a lot of them. And some of them are pretty broad. 2C says that the practitioner can request a waiver, so they don't have to do it electronically. And letter D says that if they determine that it'd be impractical for the patient to get the drugs by electronic prescription, it could delay things, and then they could do it in writing instead, or if it's Schedule 3 through 5, perhaps they could even do it verbally. This for patients in hospice care, patients in nursing homes. And then letter H is kind of a big one too. If they determine that it's the best interest of the patient to take the prescription around and do some price shopping, they can still do a written prescription. So again, the study tip on the bottom of page 91 tells you that even though, yes, we have mandatory electronic prescriptions for all prescriptions in Florida, there's just too many exceptions, so you need to know the rules for the others as well. All right. So given that, we turn to page 92, and this section, letter D, we're talking about written controlled substance prescriptions. And DEA requires written controlled substance prescriptions to be manually signed by the practitioner, by the prescriber, and dated on the date issued. In Florida, written controlled substance prescriptions must be written on a counterfeit-proof prescription pad. So before we went electronic, they went with counterproof prescription pads, but those rules are still in place even though most things have gone electronic. I think it's important you know the details of this because for some reason they like to get into the details, and so I've included all the requirements of these counterfeit prescription pads. You have to order them from authorized vendors who know how to make these security features, and there's got to be the background's got to be a certain color. There's got to be a watermark. If it's photocopied, the word void or illegal appears. I do think you need to know all of these details on the counterfeit prescription pad, and it's even a frequently asked questions in the Florida Department of Health website that's still up, so that's why it's important to know that. Interestingly, number 3 on page 92, in Florida, a prescription for a controlled substance may not be issued on the same prescription blank. Remember, we're talking about written prescriptions here, with a non-controlled substance, or for a controlled substance in a different schedule. So if you got a written prescription and it's got a Schedule 2 drug and a Schedule 3 drug, that would not be valid. Or if it's got a Schedule 3 drug and a non-controlled drug, that would not be valid. Now you can always fix that somehow by maybe keeping the Schedule 2 and taking a verbal prescription for the Schedule 3 through 5 of the non-controlled substance. But it's just kind of an interesting Florida thing that's in the Florida Controlled Substance Act that they definitely could ask you about. So make sure you study that on number 3, and also the study tip on page 92 as well. You should know the mandatory elements of a controlled substance prescription. And those are listed for you on page 92 and 93. common sense stuff like the name and address of the patient, the drug name, the quantity prescribed. Florida does require that the quantity prescribed be written out both in text and numerically, so as a word, to prevent people from adding a zero onto the quantity. So there's an example of that for you on the top of page 93. And I think, when you have a list of mandatory elements like that, you really do have to kind of memorize that list. Again, a lot of it's common sense, but make sure you know the specific Florida requirements because they might be different from other states if you're coming from another state. Okay, let's talk about verbal, fax, and electronic prescriptions. We'll first start with verbal prescriptions. So verbal prescriptions or telephone prescriptions are not valid for Schedule II drugs except in an emergency. We'll cover that when we get to the Schedule II in the next lesson. But they are valid for Schedule III through V. There is a very unique Florida law that restricts the dispensing of Schedule III controlled substances from a verbal prescription to a 30-day supply. And I think the reason for this goes back to those pain management clinic days. And this was back when those hydrocodone combination products such as Vicodin were still in Schedule 3. They of course now are in Schedule 2, so that you can't have verbal prescriptions from those. But the concern back then was, since they were Schedule 3, they could be called in. They wanted to limit it, at least on a verbal prescription, and they put this restriction, but it's for all Schedule 3 drugs. And that law is still in the books. You'll see in the bonus study tip on page 93, there was a kind of a question there. It was, if verbal Schedule 3 prescriptions are limited to a 30-day supply, if it's got refills on it, what if the refills go past 30 days? And the Board of Pharmacy did clarify this, that as long as the refills are authorized, they can be dispensed, but each refill may not exceed a 30-day supply, which kind of makes sense to follow the intent of the law that was passed. Okay, so fax and electronic prescriptions for controlled substances. First of all, make sure you understand that a fax prescription is not an electronic prescription. Electronic prescriptions have to meet very specific DEA requirements, right? And both the pharmacy's computer system, prescriber system have to be audited and approved and meet all kinds of security requirements. So fax prescriptions may sound like they're electronic, but they are not. Really, fax prescriptions are more treated like a verbal prescription, because when faxes were first started, they were transmitted through telephone lines. I know now that they can go through the internet to do faxes now. So fax prescriptions, kind of like verbal prescriptions, are only valid for Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances. They're generally not valid for Schedule 2 prescriptions, but there's an exception to that, and we'll cover that when we get to the Schedule 2 section in the next lesson. And the electronic prescriptions on the top of page 94, as I mentioned, have to meet all kinds of DEA security requirements to be in what's called an ECPS, EPCS, electronic prescription for controlled substance, EPCS. It's the DEA terminology for an electronic prescription. So just make sure you don't get mixed up between electronic and fax, because they are slightly different. Okay, and that's it for this lesson. We're going to pick up again and focus specifically on Schedule 2 prescriptions in our next lesson, beginning on page 94.